reservoir hole.
We're here back for another install. Luckily it's cooled down, but we've got brake pads, rotors, fluid, sensors. We got a full brake job today. It's a DIY. It's something you can do easily on your driveway, and we're gonna outline how to do it front to rear. You don't really need any special tools, luckily, for this job. Just your basic screwdriver, socket set, and all that kind of stuff will get you through. Just a quick rundown of the stuff that we have here. We've got front pads. These are from Powerstop. They supplied most of the kit for a really reasonable price, front to rear. Comes with front rotors, which are, show this real quick. They are cross drilled, slotted, and they look really nice. Other than that, that's pretty much all. That's kind of a quick rundown, so we're gonna get to installing these. Before you guys get started, you're gonna wanna actually take the reservoir cap off, make sure you clean it out, and you're gonna wanna put a towel around that. The reason being is because when you go to compress the pads, it is gonna push fluid back into the reservoir, and you don't want it to start leaking out all over your paint. It's also a good idea to siphon out some of the brake fluid, that way you know that it's not gonna overflow. But that's just a quick tip before we get started, so nothing. Once you do that, now we can get started to do the brakes. Push a brake.
Yeah.
So you got to get this clip off, and the way to do that is you got to push back and get a screwdriver and slowly kind of wiggle it out, but get out of the way because this shit's gonna fucking go crazy. Just like that. So what you're gonna want to do is get a screwdriver, and you're gonna want to get in between the rotor and the pad, kind of just press back, and then do it on the bottom, and then you can get enough room to fish the screwdriver in the middle and just push back on the pad. You're gonna have to push back quite a bit to get this pad to go all the way back, so just keep prying until you see the piston retract. To make it a little easier, I usually break this rotor screw loose. It's a 5mm hex. You kind of just get a hex and then just kind of smack it like that. And by the way, if you have to drill these out, no big deal. You don't really have to put these back on. They're only held in for manufacturing purposes. So if yours are C's, you can always just drill them out. Once you do that, we're gonna go ahead and remove this brake wire sensor. Since you have to replace these whenever you do a brake job, I kind of just pull up on it like that. And then it fishes out through here through this green clip. It just unclips from the back. Got it unclipped, and then there's another clip that goes right here. You just pull it out, and then back here there's another clip like that, and then you got a box, black box. There's two tabs. Just got to undo it like that, pull it open, and then you got your brake wire sensor right here. And all you gotta do is, you can see there's a tab right there. There's only one. You just gotta push it in and then just pull like that. There's your old brake wire sensor. We got to take the two caliper bolts off in order to get the rotor off. This one's on super tight. Now that we have the caliper off, normally what I do is I just get a jack stand to hold the caliper up. That way it's not held by the line. Get it kind of secure just like that. And now we can get this rotor off. One way I do it is I grab a hammer. Since we're not reusing these and we're not resurfacing them, we can kind of just... After you get the rotor off, you're going to want to clean all this off. Use like a Scotch-Brite and some brake cleaner to get all the rust off. That way it's easier to put the new rotor on. Make sure you get everything off because it would be kind of difficult to get the rotor back on with all this grime and shit. So now that we got the rotor hub all cleaned off, next thing you'll need to do is clean off the rotor itself with some brake cleaner. Typically during the manufacturing process they do put an oil on here to prevent them from rusting, so we'll knock that off real quick. Now that that's clean, it's time to put this on.
Well, she's gonna buy some off of you.
Yeah, she is. We're actually gonna disassemble the caliper real quick. You just have to slide off the sliding pins to clean them up and re-grease them, and then we'll just pop the pads back in and away it goes. Super easy. So I got the caliper held up right here. To get the pads out, you just gotta kind of push out. You can already see the pads already poking out on this one. And that one comes right out. Like that. That's the inner one. And then the outer one can sometimes get somewhat stuck, so kind of have to kind of bang on it, just like that. And then that comes out. And then what I usually do is I'll actually take apart the caliper off the sliding bracket like that. And you're gonna want to clean all this gunk up because you just don't want that being there. So we'll just leave that hanging for the moment like that. And we'll move on to cleaning these guide pins real quick. A little bit of brake cleaner, just kind of shine these up. You want to make sure you do this because if you have caliper wear issues on your pads, more than likely these are binding up, and that's the reason why your brake pads aren't wearing evenly. So it's usually a pretty misstep. So I just clean these up and get some grease and grease these bitches. Luckily Powerstop does give you a packet of grease. You don't have to put much, just have to be kind of liberal on it. And thumbs up if you like our night DIYs. This is how most people I feel that are watching our videos actually do their DIYs, is at night. So
After work.
Yep, that's how it is. Just before a major holiday weekend, which is 4th of July for us.
Happy 4th.
Yeah, if you're from the US. So now that we got that all greased up, now we can clean up this caliper piston real quick. Get all this old gunk off. That is, I don't even know what this is. It's just like old like shit. Don't forget to beep that out. All it is, it just goes into those two holes. Just slides back in. Can be kind of tricky, but once it slides in, it slides in. There we go. So, and then once you have that, you're gonna take your pads, and the inside one is this one with the clip. Normally what I do is I will grease up the contact points to reduce the amount of squeal that the brake pads emit. If you have any kind of racing pads such as like EBC yellow stuff or Hawk HPS or even Hawk DTC pads, they're gonna make squeal no matter what. But to mitigate it and lessen it, I usually just grease up the pad contact points. Again, don't need that much. Kind of just do it like that. Don't need to put a lot. Put some on there. Sorry if I'm blocking the light. Some right there, and then again right here. And since this is the inside one, this is the one that goes into the caliper piston. So all you got to do is grab the caliper up, and then gotta slide it into the groove. Once you get that in, again, you need to grease up the brake pad. Same ordeal on the edges like that. Don't need too much. Kind of also grease where the caliper is going to be touching the brake pad itself as well. And just do like that. And now you can slide the caliper back on and bolt it right up. Hopefully, if I compress the piston back, if I did. So I'm just tightening up the caliper mounting bolts. They have to be pretty snug. Once you got them all snugged up to maybe half a turn to get them to snug up. They don't need Loctite. They just need to be nice and tight. Next, we need to install the brake wear sensor, the new one. The way that goes is there is a indentation, you can see it. It's gonna look like that. This is gonna face the rotor side, so it's gonna go like that into the pad. So let's see if I can get some good light. You can see right there, my finger's at that groove. That's where the sensor sits. So you're gonna wanna just put it in like that, and it clips right in. Do want to be careful, you don't want to push too hard on this because these sensors are pretty fragile and they do break pretty easily. But as you can see, that's how it's supposed to sit. And then you route the wire through here, through this brake bleeder fitting. Route this up. Don't forget, when you're putting this brake wire on, there is a green little clip that holds it onto the strut. It's this guy right here. Just gotta feed it through like that, and then it clips down here. You'll see it, there's a hole. And then you just gotta reconnect your brake wear sensor, and you are done on this side. And it's a repeat process of the right side, except you don't have a brake wear sensor on that side, so you don't have to worry about that, but the steps are pretty much the same. The last thing you need to do is to put this retaining clip on. It can be a little difficult. What I usually do is I get the top started. This tab it sits inside, so you want to get it like that. And then I usually pull down the bottom like so, and I get that kind of pushed in. It can be kind of difficult. Just be a little patient. Kind of like that. And then kind of tap it in lightly with a mallet just to make sure it's in. And that's pretty much it. That takes care of this side. So we're gonna move on to the next, which is the rears, and this is pretty much a repeat on the right side, so that's all we're gonna showcase, but it's pretty straightforward. So the first thing I'm gonna do is crack off these rotor set screws. It's a 6mm Allen socket. Pro tip, you can pull the handbrake up to hold the rotor in place. That way it's a little easier to break these loose, because these ones usually do get pretty seized on there. And kind of tap on it just in there, and then with one quick twist like that, they'll come right out. And there's two of them, so make sure you get both of them. And now that we got the rotor screws off, they came off perfectly fine. The next step we're going to do is take off this anti-rattle clip. It's the same thing in the front. What you're going to be doing is pushing up on it where it's kind of loose like that, and get a flathead. While you're pushing up, you're going to kind of pry out where the clip is out, and then you can just pull this out like that. It's pretty easy. It's not too difficult. It's probably one of the easier BMWs to get that rotor set screw out. Next, we're going to begin with taking off the brake wear sensor. So on the E46, there's a brake wear sensor on the driver's side, as you saw earlier, and there's one on the passenger rear. There's no brake wear sensor on the left side of the rear or in the passenger front, so just do keep that in mind. Same thing with the front, you just want to pull up, and this one kind of sneaks around quite a bit from here all the way to a box back here. We'll showcase that in a bit, but for now we're going to keep moving forward. Again, you have to compress the pistons in the caliper. The way I do that is I get a pry bar, and I kind of wedge it between the rotor and the pad, and I kind of push them back from the corners like that. And then once I got it going, I can stick it in the middle right here and push back on the pad itself, just like that. And do note, just be careful and make sure that the reservoir doesn't overfill. So again, that's why I mentioned earlier in the video, you might want to siphon out some brake fluid before you start this. But once you get that, now that those are back, I'm gonna go check on that reservoir and make sure we're not overflowing. So So we just checked. I siphoned out some of the reservoir earlier, so we're about just a little past the max fill. But we're going to be flushing the brake fluid in a bit, so we're actually okay at the moment.
Well, now that we got the caliper piston compressed all the way back, you just got to loosen up the 16mm caliper bolts in the back. Pretty easy to get to. And once you get those two off, then you'll be able to get the rotor off.
Caliper just slides right off, super easy. You might have to kind of wiggle it a little bit, but it will come just like that. Again, get your jack stand to hold the caliper up in place so it doesn't put any massive strain on the brake line. And we're kind of lucky, these rotors are coming off pretty easily, but sometimes you would have to, you know, take a hammer to it. So hopefully in your case it's the same as ours, where these come off really easy. And then once you have these off, you're going to want to inspect the e-brake assembly. You want to check for the rotor shoes to make sure it's not excessively worn. In this case, these look really good. And if you need to adjust the e-brake assembly, this is the best time to do it as well. Basically, you would just flip this little, I guess, teeth right here, and it expands the rotor shoes outward or inward depending on how tight you want this. If you do end up adjusting this, you want to make sure that there's only enough drag on the rotor itself. You shouldn't have excessive drag. We'll highlight it right now, but we're going to go ahead and clean all this up and then put the new rotor on.
Wave, and then you just
So we pretty much adjusted the e-brake. When you put the rotor on, you should have about this much play. You'll kind of hear it. So you see, if you hear that amount of drag and the rotor kind of freely moves, this is about the amount of adjustment you want in the e-brake shoes. You don't want to go too far past that, because then you'll actually start locking up the rotor when the e-brake's up, or you'll actually lock up the, let me take that back. You'll lock up the rotor with the e-brake down, and that's not what you want. So you want just enough drag on the e-brake, but not too much. So now that we have that adjusted, we're going to put the rotor set screws back in and I'll finish this up. If you're going to plan on adjusting the e-brake assembly, you're going to be doing it through the actual wheel lug nut hole. What you need to do is actually line up the hole till you can actually see the teeth of the adjustment. It's really hard to tell, but you'll know when you see it. You're going to be essentially moving the adjuster either forward or back depending on how tight or loose you need to make it, but you'll be making the adjustments through the lug nut bolt hole if you need to. Otherwise, if you're happy where the adjustment of the e-brake is, then I'd say just leave it. Now that we're done with the rotor, we're just going to replace the pads. It's super easy. All you gotta do is knock the old ones out. Again, just like the front, we're going to pull this bracket off and clean these. Get some brake cleaner on a rag. We're going to wipe these pins down. And we're going to put some new grease on it and put the pads back on. Now that we got the caliper slide pins cleaned up, we're going to grease them up real quick. I also just wipe these down. I don't put any grease, I just wipe them down, get them nice and clean. Just put a little bit of grease, not too much, and then just kind of evenly get it all over. So now that we got the caliper bracket back on, we're going to just lightly grease up the pads as well. We're going to put a little bit of grease on the contact points where the metal retaining bracket is. So you just got to get it lined up with the bracket. You just slot in. We're just going to bring the caliper back over the rotor. You might need to kind of wiggle it in, just like that. And you get your two caliper bracket bolts and just thread them back in. So next we're going to put the anti-rattle clip back on. And you know it's in right when you know those two are seated fully down like that and these clips are holding against the caliper. Last but not least is we're going to have to do the brake wear sensor. This one's pretty long. It routes from the caliper all the way through the control arm to a junction box underneath here. There is a panel you have to get off, so we'll show you how to do that right now. So we got the cables all in at this point. You're probably going to have quite a bit of difficulty getting the cover to go back on. Just be really patient with it. It's in a really stupid location, and don't ask me why it's there. So, but once you get it on, you just got to route the wire the way it went and get it on all the clips. And then again, just like the front, you're going to make sure that this end is facing the actual rotor side, and it clips into a little valley right there. So just push it in, and then you put it onto the cover for the brake bleeder screw, and that pretty much wraps up the install. At least we're going to continue on, and we're actually going to flush the system, so we'll show you how to do that right now. The last thing we're going to be doing is actually flushing the entire old fluid out of the system. The way we're going to be doing it is going to be a little bit untraditional. We're going to be using a power bleeder, more specifically just for this car. It makes bleeding so much easier and much more efficient. However, you could still do it with the two-man method, with somebody pumping the pedal and holding it and one other guy actually cracking open the bleeder loose. But we're going to opt to use this method. The way this works is you put brake fluid into this canister, you pump it up to 15 pounds of pressure, and it's essentially pressurizes the entire brake system, that it pushes old fluid into this container at each of the caliper. The way you'll go about doing this is you'll start at the right rear, then you move to the left rear, then the right front, and then the left front. So you start from the furthest caliper from the master cylinder all the way to the closest. So that's how you're going to be doing it. So we're going to fill this up, pressurize the system, and start flushing the fluid right now. We've got the system pressurized. We've got a good amount of fluid through the line, despite it looking like there's a bit of air here. There really isn't. We have it at about 16.5 pounds. So the only thing we have to do left is connect our reservoir right here, our little cup right here that I use, and crack the bleeder on the far right, the far right, and then let the old fluid flush through until we see clean fluid, and we're pretty much done. So as you can see, it's self-bleeding itself right now with the pressure bleeder. But you can also see at the bottom, there's a lot of dark particulate matter that's been floating around in the brake fluid. Normally you wouldn't really get this all out with the traditional brake bleeding method, so this method really helps. But you can already see how the top part's already pretty much lighter in color than the bottom. So it's very beneficial to flush your fluid out whenever you do a brake job. That way you can get as much of this dirty stuff out of the system as best as possible. You're gonna want to have like a spray bottle on hand or some kind of water bottle, because you might get a little bit of brake fluid on the caliper, and water neutralizes brake fluid. So once you do that, we just got to clean this side up and go to the rest of the corners, and we're pretty much done. You're gonna want to have like a spray bottle on hand or some kind of water bottle, because you might get a little bit of brake fluid on the caliper, and water neutralizes brake fluid. So once you do that, we just got to clean this side up and go to the rest of the corners, and we're pretty much done. Recording. So we just wrapped up with the last caliper for bleeding. We did it twice on each corner. The first time was to flush out any of the old fluid, and then the second time started to bring more fresh fluid. So thanks to this tool, it made it pretty easy. We didn't have to use two people to bleed the brakes. So now that the brake reservoir is topped off to the max level, the only thing left to do is actually bed the brakes in, which we're going to show real quick. But that pretty much wraps up the install, the brake flush, and everything. So we're going to lower the car, get inside the car, take it for a spin, test the brakes, and show you how to bed them.